this topic I tried to enumerate, but it's kind of hard sometimes to say that what is, how much you can separate issues. So there's a little bit of fudging going on here. But I do want to quote an author who was my fellow student at the University of Sussex in 1968, Ian McEwan, and he has just published another book, very, very well received, perhaps one of the best known British authors that there is, Ian McEwan. This novel has an awful lot to say about Berlin in particular in 1989, but I just won't have the time to get into it. But it's kind of an interesting story about how his wife abandoned him and his child in order, because she was of German background, in order to come back to Berlin and author a novel so that she would be in the category of Günter Grass and Thomas Mann and so on. So this is a meeting in which they took place in Berlin itself. But also he has written an awful lot of history over the period of this main character's life, and a lot of it has to do with politics. And so one quote I found on page 475. So it was published literally last month. One quote that was published in 20. The one quote that was published in this novel is the following: There were nations, plural, it's plural, run by well-dressed criminal gangs, intent on self-enrichment, kept in place by security services, by the rewriting of history, and passionate nationalism. Russia was just one. The USA, in the delirium of anger, delusional conspiracies, and white supremacy, could yet become another. Now, the reassuring news is, as I studied the U.S. election results, it appears as if the United States has stepped away from the brink in terms of a democratic breakdown. And I think the voting really was very, very, very kind of even-handed, of course, somewhat polarized, but at the same time, it wasn't going to be a sweep by supporters of Donald Trump. So I think a lot of intelligence went into voting in the United States yesterday. We don't have all the votes in yet. I want to very briefly talk about Thucydides, because Thucydides has been around for a long time. You can't go wrong by quoting ancient Greek historians. So for those of you who are scholars and actually sort of know Greek and Latin fairly well, Thucydides can help us learn about the importance, especially of removing fear from our lives. And his book consists of really meditating on fears. And so I thought this was a very good idea in terms of looking at cultural diplomacy. One of the most important things is we need to remove fear from our lives. And that is exactly what Thucydides tells us to do. One of the ways he does that is he categorizes 5 different types of fears and the ways that we can break from these type of fears. In fact, there was not in classical Greek literature any word that matches the modern English word for fear in its comprehensive-ness. So I'll just go very, very quickly through these 5 terms and then get over to the issue of Ukraine. Deos is a term derived from the Greek word to doubt. And in Homeric Greek, to doubt signifies also to be afraid. So that's one category of Thucydides' notion of fear, the importance of deos, to doubt. Classical scholars single out phobias, of course, which corresponds to a stronger, more instinctive and less rational fear of an imminent threat, a direct imminent threat. Rather than exclusively standing for fear, The English rendering of phobia has been transformed into a wide gamut of human passions. So these include animosity. So phobia now means animosity, antipathy, antagonism, even hatred towards adversaries. And of course, xenophobia comes straight from this idea of phobos. So I'm putting this one aside. There's also a term called ekplexis, which involves shock, astonishment, terror, trepidation, even panic, as well as moral panic. So we see a crescendo of panic occurring when Thucydides has used the term ekplexis. The last two terms are particularly interesting. One is orodia, and it includes only 5 times in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and really refers mostly to quotes. So the case study that I've associated with this notion of orodia is I think, very, very fitting of Vladimir Putin, who is a speechmaker, a rhetorician in chief. So I'm going to lower him down the peg and see him as merely a rhetorician in chief. Of course, you could say the same thing about Zelensky too, that maybe he is, maybe even more than Putin, a rhetorician in chief. When Thucydides wanted to capture a fear evoked by a breakdown in confidence in the state of things, he invoked a hypopsia. Its literal meaning is looking underneath the surface, evoked by a suspicion that what will be discovered beneath will be found to be threatening. So that's the 5th term, and I think all of these, as we study it much more carefully, disaggregating the term fear will help us us to rally around this notion of trying to live in a less fearful world. Fears cannot explain, however, the distinct circumstances that drive countries to conflict. And so I have a short list of why conflicts occur. And here's the really interesting thing, but a lot of people have assumed that this is going to be the case. A simple fact, and arguably an iron law of international relations, is that struggles over territory, often caused by irredentist claims, have caused more wars than any other explanation in the period from 1648 and the time of Westphalia to the present time. Contiguity, territorial contiguity, is the main reason why wars take place over history, over la longue durée. It has a great impact on the likelihood of war than other factors. For example, membership of a particular alliance, the type of regime, the level of development, the extent of militarization that occurs, the status of power, or differentials in relative capabilities. So the bottom line for a lot of the historians and the political scientists, and especially I'm thinking of the people who wrote a book called Correlates of War way back in the 1970s, is that territorial contiguity explains most wars that take place. I also wanted to emphasize, apart from the war proneness of countries living next to each other, I think a lot of the research that has been done on this subject eventually bogs down in sort of descriptive analyses of why in Cyprus Turks and Greeks don't get along, and that type of thing. It really is so highly descriptive in its analysis. But there are some insights from psychiatry, and I am not a psychiatrist by any stretch of the imagination, but some of them, as I've read through some of these articles, offer explanations. For example, Sigmund Freud came to believe, because he didn't instantly come to this decision, he came to believe that the narcissism of minor differences comes into play in roughly similar type nations. Quote, "It is precisely communities with adjoining territories and related to each other in other ways as well, who are engaged in constant feuds and in ridiculing each other. Germans and South Germans, the English and the Scotch," I'm quoting literally from his passages. I gave this phenomenon the name Narcissism of Minor Differences, a name which does not do much to explain it. So he admits that he's not going very far in explaining what narcissism of minor differences. So, opportunities for some further research in this subject. It's a convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction of the inclination to aggression. And so I quote several other important theorists. One is Turkey in several occasions, are very, very important, studying the narcissism of small and minor differences. And so Raymond Volkan has actually written about the Ukraine war very, very recently. And so he says that the traumatic phases that someone like Putin was going through was shocking. He actually, Raymond Volkan said that it wasn't blaming Putin at all, but simply going through the process of having so many different traumatic episodes in the time that the war has begun. So Raymond Volkan puts it this way: a stage of malignant political propaganda is creating a societal preoccupation with the large group's psychological borders through an obsession with physical borders. So this is what Putin has done, is emphasize the physical borders when starting off with psychological ones. This is the idea of expanding Russia's imperium. This stage was quickly followed by an entitlement ideology, which turns into dehumanizing the enemy. So that's the further stage. Revengeful actions are taking place, allowing mass killings and other inhumane actions to be committed. So this is part of this notion of narcissism of minor differences. I also have a quote from Dr. Kocher's I think an analysis of one more person who talks about minor differences, who's Turkish. I have his name further down, and who actually says it's not really a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of capitalism. That's what he put it down as. But that's going down a different path. So clashes of civilization as go-to explanation is what I'm interested in. When coupled with the narcissism of minor differences and with psychoanalytic explanations of why Russia's war was launched, we're arriving at a broader understanding of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. And some people have disagreed very strongly with Samuel Huntington. I won't be able to go through all the details of Huntington's 7 different types of civilizations and why they may or may not clash. And also, I won't get into much detail about Ukraine as specifically a cleft civilization. A cleft civilization, in Huntington's terms, really means a very complicated society in which ethnicity and religion and linguistic arenas and many other groups are occurring, and it really is impossible to classify Ukraine in those respects. And that's the funny thing, because we are now hearing from Kiev that Ukraine is a very united country with absolutely no cleft elements of it at all, whereas in 33 years ago, I'm sorry, not 33 years ago, I think in 1993, when Huntington wrote this particular book, he actually was specifying that Ukraine was exceptional in being such a complicated society. Also very interesting from this one particular author I'm thinking about, named Errol Henderson, a very unknown author, generally speaking, is the importance of the democratic peace argument, that we all, as international relations scholars, learn about the importance of democratic peace. The democracies do not go to war against each other. So he says that the form of government, democracy versus dictatorship, and the distance between or proximity of states are far stronger explanatory factors. In other words, democracy does count in preventing wars. So if both Russia and Ukraine were democracies, and I hold that neither are, then there would be no real issue about going to war. So causal factors that affect conflicts include joint democracy as reducing and dampening the impact of conflict. So maybe I won't go any further with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Yet, there's another aspect to it. Huntington's book is called The Clash of Civilizations and Remaking the World Order. And that's what we have to really put our fingers on. Remaking the world order, which might provide the most explanatory power to explaining why war came to Ukraine in 2022. Russia's relations with the West, and these include sort of blocks such as the EU 27, the G7, NATO, and for example, AUKUS in Australia, that brings Australia in, Five Eyes, which includes New Zealand as well. So many different types of alliance systems that the United States has built up. These are the confrontations that Russia has been facing. And Huntington's paradigm-shifting insight that the post-Cold War was rearranging itself along ethnic, religious, and civilizational lines seems to be both an innovative approach, but also one that, in many respects, is dismissed at the present time. In other words, culture doesn't. I actually wrote books on things like cultural turn in international relations, but I probably need to apologize because culture is being diminished as a hard military struggles are occurring in their place. So the Clash of Civilizations caught the imagination of scholars, as well as political aficionados and curious citizens around the globe. Variations on both the clashes and the civilizations angles were plentiful in the years that followed, and Huntington himself was rather kind of anecdotal. He wasn't taking this Clash of Civilizations all that seriously. And I want to get into the next stage of why wars have occurred in places like Ukraine. And I think one of the reasons might be the importance of creating multipolar regimes. So Dr. Kocher has already talked about the importance of multipolar regimes. And my point of view is that, in fact, Russia and China do not recognize that there's a multipolar regime at the present time. They think there is continuously a unipolar regime. And the real problem is that as Russia and China and many other countries, India and Pakistan and, and the BRICS countries and much of Latin America and the Middle East, and many countries really do still see the world as a unipolar world. They know where the money comes from, and the influence of the United States and various types of political decision making. So this is what's happening: is that remaking the world order, displacing an essentially unipolar system with we'll skip over the bipolar. Bipolar ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. So we're skipping over the bipolar and we're moving into a multipolar system. And this really seems to be the main purpose in the case of Russia involved in this war in Ukraine. How did China fit in this scenario? For Putin at Samarkand, one of the rare times that he's left Russia, both countries, said Putin, stand together for a just, democratic, multipolar world order based on international law and the central role of the United Nations. And so the United Nations comes into play too. And not on some rules that someone invented and attempts to impose on others without explaining why they are. So I will not get into any further details about the kind of ethnic relations and the linguistic associations in Ukraine. I actually wrote an article on first of all on the multi-ethnic composition of Ukraine. This was in around 2000, 2002. Of course, now the powers that be in Ukraine would deny that there's anything really multi-ethnic about Ukraine. But that was the case when I actually did some research, some hard-headed research in Ukraine in around 2001, 2002. I also wrote an article on, so this comes back to the importance of hubris. So I wrote an article on Sochi's, the Sochi hubris that was developing in Vladimir Putin. The bottom line is that it was Putin that lost Ukraine. It was Putin that lost Ukraine. He was so busy with making sure that Sochi was going to be a very successful Winter Olympics. Spent all his time with athletes. His girlfriends are athletes, and so it's a long history of kind of maybe because of. Like Saakashvili said, I'm a huge man and Putin is a little one, and that. So maybe that was why he got involved in all these athletic pursuits. But in any case, the argument, because I actually do a time series of analysis, and the very day that the putsch or the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime took place, that very day, Putin was hanging out at a hockey match or at the bobsledding or this type of thing. That very day. It took him about a week, and you can see it on my time series analysis, before Putin called this National Security Council meeting in Sochi after the Olympic Games were over. His response was belated to what was happening in Ukraine. Also wanted to mention, and I'm going to close very soon, is that one of the political scientists, not political scientists, but one of the prime ministers that I have the highest respect for is New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. I've been there twice in the last couple of years. And she gave a talk at the Lowy Institute about 4 or 5 months ago. And she made the claim that it's not ever about democracy versus autocracy. She doesn't believe that type of nonsense. She doesn't believe you can see the world in terms of black and white. It's much more complicated than that. And so that's why, following what Jacinda Ardern has been saying in New Zealand, I think compared to Australia, she's really becoming very, very level-headed, realistic, maybe kind of a hard-headed realism on her part. And it's very, very different from what we're hearing from Biden and from and other people in the West, and Boris Johnson is a piece of work. And then also want to say very, very briefly about the Maidan events. I was not in Ukraine at that time. I was teaching Ukrainian students in Warsaw. I had maybe 80, 100 Ukrainian students in Warsaw. And what happened was they were heading off for the Maidan. And what the Maidan ended up being is really a place where the representatives of the people really never made it into power. So we have the Yatsenyuks and the Klitschkos and this type of thing. And when I was watching this night after night and day after day live on Ukrainian television while living in Warsaw, what I noticed was that the people that got the most applause from the Maidan audience were not the Klitschkos and not the Yatsenyuks and not the leaders that were going to take over Ukraine and not the Poroshenkas. And so it'd be interesting to do some research on exactly what level of applause was greeted each particular speaker. No one has done this. So, final section: unbridled multipolarity. This is really the main cause of the war. That Russia and China and so many other countries in the world. There's a rough estimate of about 60% of the countries in the world really do want a genuine multipolar world. So bringing about fundamental changes in the polarity of the international system can prove catastrophic. That's the problem, to all sides. Within the decade, China has joined Russia in challenging the US. Both have argued for a return not to bipolarity, but to multipolarity. This is the moment when the struggle for multipolarity clashes with the existent order of unipolarity in different shapes and configurations, particularly with the establishment of the EU, of NATO, of ASEAN, of AUKUS, of Five Eyes, intelligence alliances, and so on. The US continues to reign supreme as unipolar power, even if regularly defeated in far-off battlefields. So you can lose the battlefields, but you continue to push unipolar power. So the frustration of other aspirant powers is self-evident, reaching for a multipolar world in a world of polycrises. So the bottom line right now is we're facing polycrises, and a multipolar world is one of them. And finally, I think this is very, very important for me to say, and that is, what about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine? So we have a report from the United Nations UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There are 14 million people who have been either forced to go to the West, mostly to the West, or were displaced within Ukraine. So about 7 million people going to the West, 7 million people displaced from the homes that they had. There are I'm looking specifically at Russia, an additional 2.8 million refugees have been recorded crossing into the border with Russia. So you might wonder, Ukraine, war there, and people, 2.8 million crossing into Russia. Some of these Ukraine refugees report voluntarily moving through Russia, but as a means of eventually reaching the European Union. So this is just, since you can't cross from Ukraine into Poland, for example, or Lithuania, this is a way of getting to Europe. So you move through Russia and go down to Georgia or Armenia, someplace like that. There have been also troubling reports of forcible transfers of Ukrainians to Russia or Russian-occupied regions, as Moscow tries to rid eastern Ukraine of people sympathetic to Ukraine. And let's be aware of the pressures that are put on people living in various countries. I'm from Quebec, in Canada, but in Europe and other places as well. We're faced with dramatic, unpredictable climate changes at the present time. We're still following repercussions from the COVID pandemic. The inflation spikes are terrible. Financial hardship, shrinking resources, underemployment, no employment, finding warmth over winter. Inept political leadership in so many countries, including who is the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who is continuing to ask for extra time, 2 more extra years for Jens Stoltenberg. A prime minister of Norway, is that really the way to go? Anyway, there's no telling what might happen next. And whether war in Ukraine will be a part of a series of cataclysms. That it's not going to be just Ukraine that brings us down. It will be many other cataclysms throughout the world. But my final conclusion is very, I think, optimistic. Is this where secret diplomacy starts taking precedence? Secret diplomacy. So cultural diplomacy obviously is important, but the way to get the job done, to bring peace to Ukraine, to limit Russia's influence over Ukraine, is through secret diplomacy. And one of the models, it wasn't so much the subtlety role that I was thinking about, but it was the way that communism was broken down in Europe. And so where did it all begin? It began in June of 1989 in Poland, where we had a roundtable discussion that led to an agreement, which produced in July of 1989, it produced elections in which the opposition Solidarność party won all the seats in the House, in the deputies, for the deputy seats, not the Senate seats. So this was the way to make it forward. And obviously Poland was then tagged as being soft on liberalism. We didn't really do much to drive communists out of power. But I think this kind of incremental approach, basically sitting down with the opposition, sharing discussions, this type of thing. This is the way really to go forward. A kind of a similar round table between Ukraine and Russia. And if you can get them there, and maybe I think Erdogan might be just the man to do that. That might be the best solution. So I believe secret diplomacy is very much taking place at the present time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Taras. We'll take one or two brief questions and comments. Just as an announcement, there's a dictator in this room and there's two defenders of human rights. I was planning to be the dictator and with an iron fist to violate your human right. I was going to plan to violate your human right for a coffee break. However, we have two defenders of human rights. One is Esteban, who kindly bought water for everyone, so we do have water down there in case anyone needs. And we have Didem, who suggested that we try to do a 5-minute break after we take a few questions. In my experience, 5-minute breaks never work. It'll be 20 minutes, but let's try. If you all promise to be disciplined, after a few questions for Dr. Taras, we will try a 5-minute break just so you can do what you have to do. But then we have two keynote speakers. The technician is coming at 12:15 to operate the PowerPoint, so therefore we can't go too delayed with that, but let's try our best. So first of all, questions or comments. I'm sure this excellent presentation has inspired you. Yes, so there are the two, so we'll take those two. And try to keep the questions brief and the response brief.
Yes.
Okay.
His talk was so elaborate. My questions are, I have like two questions. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jaideep, and you spoke about multiple ideas. You started from Clash of Civilizations, then you also went to multipolar world. My first question is about Clash of Civilizations. You mentioned something very interesting called minor narcissistic tendencies in neighboring countries. You rightly said that we have seen this not only in Ukraine and Russia, but also in other parts of the world. But about Clash of Civilizations, don't you think that if politicians continue to reiterate these identities, don't you think Clash of Civilizations becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because everyone starts believing in it, and that's why the idea gets reinforced? That is my first question. And the second question about multipolar world, because you said that Russia and China have consistently believed in the idea of a unipolar world, or rather they are chasing that idea of a unipolar world. But don't you think that even the multipolar world that we live in today is in a way under the leadership of the US? Because what we have seen in the past few months is that Europe was divided. Many of the European countries initially didn't want to impose heavy sanctions. Then it was about the energy crisis. They didn't want to stop the Russian gas, but ultimately everyone had to follow the suit of the big brother. So don't you think that their idea of like that chase to the unipolar world comes from this notion that even the multipolar world that exists today is under the leadership of the US?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that great question. I simply agree with the second part of what you said. I think we're all, including it's a place like right next door, Canada. We're not about to have a major war between Canada and the United States, but I also feel that there's a real burden of responsibility on Canada to do the right thing. And so we're one of the main countries supporting, arming, training Ukrainian forces. And I think it's on behalf of the US president and some of his advisors. As far as the national identity is concerned, what I found really remarkable is that as I was writing a final chapter on the United States, which I'm kind of loath to do, just yes, and I've had death threats occasionally from students who don't like that's not. But it's I think it's fundamentally kind of a European angle because I lived in Europe for 15 years, and so national identities. What's really odd about the United States is that the national identity syndrome has really broken down. Very few Americans consider themselves first and foremost as Americans. They'll talk about gender issues and regional issues and other aspects of this kind. And very few Americans, I hope maybe after these elections that took place yesterday, there'll be more of a resurgence of interest in U.S. national identity. But it's a matter of tribal identities that are occurring in the United States. And I think some tribal identities, I think for Afro-Americans, I really would make an exception for them. They came over because they were slaves. So I completely support 100% importance of a very specific indigenous identity in the United States. But in the rest of the country, it really becomes very, very difficult to accept the fact that this country is breaking down. This country has been breaking down because of the importance of tribal identities rather than national identities. So nationalism in the United States has limits on it in the way that perhaps in Europe, a lot of nationalism has occurred. But nationalism itself is confined in much of Europe to particular minority groups. So I don't necessarily worry about what's happening in Italy with the new prime minister, nor even with Sweden, where the Sverigedemokraterna, some Sweden Democrats have shared power now with the moderate party. I think those are kind of restrained forms of nationalism. It's the bonkers, people that really are really extreme that we have to worry about. So in that case of nationalism, I do not see that really at the present time as a threat, especially not in the U.S.
Maybe there was a misunderstanding. I'll be very specific. You said clash of civilizations. The question I had was that, don't you think it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because at least from what I have heard from some of my Russian friends or even Ukrainian friends, is that the question of this identity conflict between Ukrainians and Russians was completely non-existent.
Yes.
But this was like made up mostly after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, and there were some concrete steps taken by the government, like banning the Russian language libraries or something like that. I don't have complete knowledge about it, so I won't comment confidently about it, but something like that. So don't you think that if politicians are going to reiterate the clash of civilizations theory, it is only going to be like a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because we are never going to come out of it.
We need to specify the countries involved. Ukraine is at war. You cannot blame Zelensky for trying to be another Churchill.
No, of course. I'm not saying that.
Yeah. No, but I agree with the thrust of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, and question 2? Who's in the back? Or is there a question?
I believe that we are still living in a world dominated by the US, especially when it comes to dollars and exchange between countries. However, if we suppose that we are in a transitionary period, like to switch to a more solid multipolar world, without the US being the strongest, what would be the fate of dollars, which is like the world's foremost reserve currency since the Bretton Woods of 1944? Also, along with this, what would happen to capitalism if powers like China, India, and Russia became superpowers along with the USA?
The first issue that I would bring up is the importance of liberalism and the general distaste for liberalism today. Liberalism really means neoliberalism, means the Washington Consensus, and buying U.S. dollars so that the U.S. dollar is stronger than the euro, than the British pound, than the Canadian dollar, than the Australian dollar. This at a time of war. So I'm not an economist. I have no clue why the U.S. dollar has risen, and especially with the elections that were only resolved yesterday. You would think that people were speculating on the Republicans winning. Perhaps that is the case, and the U.S. dollar will start shrinking. But I really do not understand the linkage. I would have thought that the U.S. dollar would have been weakened, given the amount of opposition to that position. And the other question you...
About capitalism, like what
the capitalism. Yeah, well, I quoted this one Turkish author who said that it's not a clash of not a clash of civilizations, a clash of capitalism. I have really, again, no idea. I mean, I like a prime minister like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who's a social democratic / labor politician. I would like to see much of the world go in that direction and turn their backs. I'm glad that the Free Democrat isn't here at this moment, but turn their backs on kind of 21st century liberalism. Liberalism has a wonderful history, especially if you read John Stuart Mill and other people in the 19th century. But at the same time, there's no place for neoliberalism and kind of predatory capitalism, which needs to be strongly opposed.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you've inspired many reactions, and our next speaker can probably pick up on that as well. But I want to thank you, first of all, for an excellent presentation, a little bit of discussion afterwards. Please.